Hi, Misha here, and this time let's talk about some self-propelled guns, anti-tank, artillery, infantry support, at least some of the lighter ones that Russia created and used in World War II, the Great Patriotic War. Here we have the SU76, then we have the SU85, and then finally the SU100. And shouldn't surprise you to know this has a 100mm gun, 85mm gun, and a 76.2mm gun. These are all 1/72 scale die-cast models. These are from Fabry. These are, the one in the middle is I think it's Atlas, or I'll tell you. It's all pretty much the same tooling used. But it did come with a case cover, whereas these don't. But these are like half the price. At any rate, yeah, we'll talk about these. Kind of the lighter range of guns. Later on, we'll get to the 122 and 152 millimeter howitzer types as well. The SU76. This one's place in history is because it was the second most mass-produced piece of Russian armor for the war. They would build just under 14,300. Of course, that is greatly eclipsed by the T-34, but it's still a very large number for any piece of armor. And considering especially it had a relatively short production run. Well, this dates back. In the 1930s, Russia did experiment with self-mobile gun, self-moving, self-propelled gun with models like the SU5, which was built on the T-26 tank chassis. But they really didn't get behind it. They were focusing on many other things. They would deploy a few in Poland and Finland in 1939, 1940. But it was really the German invasion and the Stug that came along. They really showed the benefit of basically putting as big of a gun as you could on a chassis and cranking them out. Affordable, quick to produce, easy to maintain, relatively light. Obviously, this appealed very much to what Russia was needing, but it would have to wait a little while. In 1942, the Gaz factory was experimenting with attaching various 76.2mm guns to hulls. This would be the main gun that was on the KV-1 and the original T-34. And then in October of that year, the government would officially sanction these efforts. And there would be two competing designs in November, the Gaz and one from Kirov. It would actually be the Kirov design that would be selected and put into production that December is the SU76. And this was based on the T-70 light tank chassis, but it was actually extended out a bit. It's about 5 meters, so a little longer with an extra pair of wheels. And it had a reasonably good armor and gun. But let's talk about a few things before we get into that. The original version, like the original T-70 version, had two engines in parallel. And just as happened with the T-70, this caused a lot of problems. Unlike the T-70 original version that never really was produced, the SU-76 with the parallel engines was put into production, and they would build about 550. And they would even actually deploy them to a couple of different units in January of 1943 and send them to the front, and quickly realized this was a bad idea. So production was suspended. And then in February, March, the tandem engine arrangement of the T-70M was applied to the SU-76, becoming the SU-76M, and then production was resumed. not only at Kirov, but also Gaz and several other factories besides, because these could be turned out quite efficiently and quickly. Now, the original SU76 did have a roof, although it wasn't much of one. For the M, they just did away with it entirely, although I guess it could be covered by a tarpaulin if needed. The rear was also not armored, but the front had up to 35 millimeters of armor, making this a pretty lightly armored vehicle. Had the 76 millimeter gun, the most modern version, the model 1942, and it carried 120 rounds, so decent number. And it had a 7.62 DT machine gun for self-defense. It was capable of reaching about 45 kilometers per hour, same as the T-70. And it was about 11 to 12 tons, so heavier than a light tank, but still a pretty lightweight vehicle. It had a crew of 3, driver, and then you had a loader who doubled as the commander usually, and then you had a gunner, although the positions kind of switch around. It could be commander, gunner, and loader. Either way, 3, and some sources even claim a crew of 4 were put in here. So the design was relatively maneuverable. In fact, it was found that this could traverse swampy terrains in World War II when other heavier vehicles could not, which allowed for some interesting battle tactics. It was thrown into the front, used quite extensively throughout 1943 and 44. By 1945, it was being kind of supplanted by bigger guns and newer vehicles, but was still very much in service and production. In fact, production would not halt until around October of 1945, so it outlasted the war by a few months. Like I said, they produced a little over 550 original SU76s, which were very quickly put on the second line for training. It was the SU76M that was mass-produced and just became known as the SU76, and they would build over 13,700 of those. And again, at several factories. Yeah, it was a good gun. They would use armor piercing and armor plus kind of exploding ammunition. They were able to take on the Panzer III, the Panzer IV, even the Panther if they got close enough and got a shot from the side. It was really only come up against the Tigers that it fell short. Its light armor gave it good mobility. Of course, it wasn't really well protected against cannon shells, just small arms, and having the open roof meant that it was pretty vulnerable to grenades, machine gun fire, even Molotov cocktails. But it did have some advantages. In urban warfare, having an open roof meant the crew in it could just yell down to the infantry beside, because this is usually used as an infantry support vehicle. And, it's a mutual thing. It helps support the infantry. They help protect it. So being able to just yell down to the guys on the ground helped. Also, if it got hit by an anti-tank weapon, instead of the weapon detonating inside and shooting splinters and whatnot around and butchering the crew would usually just get thrown out the top. Now, they might, break a bone by that, but it beats being destroyed by shrapnel. So in some instances, it actually was more survivable than an enclosed tank, some of the time. Obviously, it was also very vulnerable to low-flying ground attack aircraft. But, an interesting craft, and it really was able to be mass-produced, especially as the T-34 switched to the 85mm gun. That left 76mm guns free to be fitted to the SU-76 and for production to really be ramped up. And it was pretty iconic. It was used on a lot of street fighting and a lot of retaking of Eastern Europe. But it just kind of proved the concept of this. Now, it was used as a light artillery piece. In fact, it had a indirect fire range of up to 17 kilometers. Pretty good for that day and time. But the shells it fired were relatively low yield, so it wasn't a great artillery piece. It was also used, like I said, for anti-tank duty. It did okay with that. But where it really was a shining example was his assault gun. It did really well as an assault gun against fortifications, taking out light armor, that kind of thing. But it was just the first of many that Russia would kind of experiment with in World War II. The SU85. This was a true interim measure stopgap solution. The SU76, along with the original T-34, that gun could take care of original Panzers, but up against the Tiger and Panther, they basically had to get in close, get a side shot, get lucky. Well, the Red Army didn't like this. In 1943, they ordered that a new anti-tank gun be produced. And they were kind of inspired by the success of the German 88, the 8.8 centimeter gun, which for Germany was originally an anti-aircraft gun, but was very well adapted to being an anti-armor gun in North Africa. And they had their own anti-aircraft gun, the 85 millimeter. This seemed like a great thing to adapt. And a couple of different design bureaus looked at the 85. And eventually what would win out would be the D5 gun, adapted for surface use, called the D5S. And for the hull, they essentially took the SU122, which was a large caliber, but it was an assault gun. The 85 millimeter, smaller caliber, but high velocity. And they would fit this to a T-34 chassis and hull. And this would be the SU85. Now, interestingly, a lot of the factories didn't want to mess with this for various reasons, but the government persuaded them. So it would go into production that summer, and the first ones would reach units in August and September of 1943. So it missed out on the Battle of Kursk, but it was there to help mop up and kind of start the push west towards Germany. And in the beginning, it did a very good job at taking out German tanks, including Panthers and Tigers, at least the original Tiger. It was relatively maneuverable and quick, up to 55 kilometers per hour. Armor was okay for an assault gun, for an anti-tank gun, around 45, 50 millimeters, depending on which exact part of the tank you were on. Had a crew of 4, driver, commander, gunner, loader. Had the main gun, of course, also had a it did not have a 7.62 millimeter gun, at least by default. And over time in the production, there would be some changes, including to the periscopes, to the vision, to the cupola. Eventually, there would end up being an SU85M, which was kind of an interim solution to an interim solution. It's a whole thing. But it was mass-produced throughout 1943, but as you could gather, once the T-34-85 with virtually the same gun came along, there was really no reason to produce this vehicle. And it was only thanks to a shortage of materiel that it stayed in production until late 1944, and then it was pulled out. By which time, though, they'd already built over 2,650, including the SU85 and the SU85M. And, of course, these were used by Russian units, although by 1945, many had been given to Polish and Czech units fighting to free their homelands because the Russian Red Army was re-equipping with the T-34-85, as well as bigger, better assault guns and anti-tank guns. Nevertheless, some were still very much in use for the Battle of Berlin. Yeah, and it would soldier on, although it was out of production by this point. It would hang around for a bit. It was a good gun, but not a whole lot to say. It's essentially a turretless version, a casemate version of a T-34-85, if you will, and kind of led the way for developments in new anti-tank thing. But also by 1944-45, there was the Tiger II, aka the King Tiger, and even bigger German tanks were threatening to be made, like the Mouse. So by that point, the 85mm gun was having a more and more difficult time punching through the heaviest armor. And that leads us to our final vehicle. The SU85 was the stopgap. The SU100 was what they really wanted to build, at least at Euromash. They only reluctantly constructed the 85. This, though, was a true step forward, with a very influential gun. Work began in early 1944, including testing several different variants of the 100mm gun. Eventually, the D10S one would be picked. And the hull and everything was essentially the same as the SU85, meaning it's based on the T-34. But the casemate, or superstructure, had several improvements: better visibility, had a better area, more elbow room for the commander to work and observe in, improved radio, and it also had 2 ventilator units instead of 1. That might sound like a funny thing to mention, but when you're firing a big gun, being able to get fumes out and heat out really does matter. And so it was a more comfortable work environment for the crew all around, space and, well, the air they breathed. The gun, of course, itself was more powerful. This could punch through Panthers and Tigers reliably, even at quite good range. Although the King Tiger, the Tiger II, still gave it a run for its money. Still either needed to get in close or get a side shot. On the other hand, the SU100 vehicle itself had much heavier armor, up to 75mm thick, and it had more of a slope to it, so better deflection, so the crew was much better protected. Both hulls were a little over 6 meters long, but this is about 9 meters long because of the gun, whereas the 85 was a little over 8. I should point out that both of these, like the T-34, are diesel powered versus gasoline in the earlier vehicles, so that's always an advantage. Still no 7.62 machine gun, at least by default, for defense, although I've read some sources claim that they were installed at least in the field, or crew would break out submachine guns. So it had more armor protection, better visibility, quite good maneuverability, and speed about the same, 50-55 kilometers per hour. All in all, it was a really superb piece of equipment. It would pass state trials and testing and go into full production in September 1944, and this is, it replaced the SU85. The SU85M was essentially the SU100, but with the original 85mm gun, or if you like, the SU85M had a lot of the product improvements of the SU100, but kept the older gun. So there was a bit of a transitional period while enough guns and shells were being made available. And Euromash was the primary manufacturer of these, and they first started to hit units in October of 1944. So while they missed Kursk in the early stages of the invading eastern part of Germany, they were there for retaking of Hungary, and very much in evidence by the Battle of Berlin in 1945. Now, this would be an interesting case after the war. Production would continue until July, and then it would be suspended. Then in August, many SU-100s would be moved east in preparation to fight the Japanese in Manchuria and Korea, although it's unlikely they actually saw much of any combat. Afterwards, though, production would start back up again, very unique for a World War II vehicle. At this time, they would have about 2,300 in use. And then the second production run would end in 1947. These would also be the only one to be licensed produced outside of Russia in Czechoslovakia. In total, just under 5,000 SU100s were built. So smaller than the SU76, but about double that of the SU85, 85Ms. And yeah, it really was a very good anti-tank weapon. And it could have secondary support as an assault gun, although that's not really what it was made for. This was a relatively small-bore, high-velocity gun. So yeah, punching out armor was the name of the game here. And thanks to its armor, it could actually take a hit or two. That gets us through World War II. But what about post-war service? The 85 probably had the least notable service. It was quickly pulled from the Red Army in 1945. A few were kept around as training vehicles for the T-34-85. For about a decade, those would be retired around 1955 in Russia. And since they joined up with the Communist Friends and Family program, quite a few would be given to allies in Eastern Europe, as well as China, North Korea, Vietnam, and so they did see use in the Korean War. And while many nations retired theirs relatively quickly, North Korea and Vietnam would keep theirs in service for decades. It was a perfectly good gun, but frankly, the T-34-85 just was, more versatile. The SU-76, though, actually had more of a post-war career because so many were built, and because it was lightweight, it would be used in areas where that was important, or urban fighting, swampy terrain, whatever you have. These would again be given away to a lot of allies and used throughout Eastern Europe and East Asia. And many survive today in Russian museums, and in fact, it's kind of the centerpiece of any Russian museum's World War II collection to have a SU-76. But yeah, because they were light and easy to maintain, it stuck around. But the SU-100, it stuck around the longest. In Russia, it was in the front line until about 1957. However, then it was put in storage depots, and in theory at least, many are there today. About 100 were given to China. Like I said, they were produced in Czechoslovakia, and they continue. Now, a big user was Egypt. In fact, a tropicalized version, meant for desert warfare, was even produced as the SU100M. And Egypt would deploy these in 1956 in the Suez Crisis, the Sinai, 1967 during the 6 Days War, and even 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. So Egypt actually got a lot of use out of these. They went up against U.S. Shermans, even newer U.S.-made tanks like the M60. But its biggest claim was the gun. The 100mm D10 gun actually would be carried over to Russia's next light tank, the T-34. The T-44. Now, you may not know the T-44, but you know its direct descendant, which is still very much in use around the world today and still uses essentially the same 100 millimeter gun. In fact, it would become the most mass-produced tank in human history, at least up to this point. So, kind of an interesting lineage that began with the SU100. And with that, we're wrapping this video up. Appreciate you hanging out with me and talking more about Russian armor. If you have any questions or comments, please do post them below. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.